The winter of 1811 found the territory of Orleans in a state of uneasy prosperity. Along the fertile banks of the Mississippi River, 30 miles northwest of New Orleans, lay a region known as the German Coast, named for the German immigrants who had first settled there in the 1720s. By 1811, this land had been transformed into one of America's most profitable sugar-producing regions, built entirely on the backs of enslaved Africans whose suffering generated immense wealth for their white masters. The demographics of the German coast told a story that would have terrified any white planter who truly understood its implications. Enslaved people outnumbered whites by more than 4 to 1 in some parishes, with recent arrivals from Africa bringing memories of freedom and military experience that their masters desperately tried to suppress. Between 1790 and 1810, white traders had brought as many as 20,000 enslaved people directly from Africa to New Orleans, many of whom possessed knowledge of warfare, agriculture, and resistance that would prove crucial in the months to come. Before we dive into the most brutal and largest slave uprising in American history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. What you're about to hear will reveal truths that have been buried for over 2 centuries. Life on the sugar plantations of the German coast was notoriously harsh, even by the brutal standards of American slavery. The sugar harvest demanded backbreaking labor for months at a time, with enslaved workers laboring from dawn to dusk in the humid Louisiana heat, cutting cane with sharp machetes while overseers watched with whips ready to strike at the slightest sign of resistance. The processing of sugar required knowledge of complex timing and chemistry, skills that many enslaved Africans had brought from their homelands, making them invaluable yet increasingly dangerous to their masters. The plantations stretched along both banks of the Mississippi River, connected by a network of roads and waterways that allowed for communication between enslaved communities. This connectivity would prove crucial to the events that were about to unfold, as enslaved people had developed sophisticated systems for passing information between plantations despite the constant surveillance of their overseers. Among the most important figures in this tense landscape was Charles Dessalines, a mixed-race man who served as an overseer on Colonel Manuel Andre's woodland plantation. Born around 1789, Dessalines occupied a unique position in the racial hierarchy of Louisiana. Neither fully enslaved nor truly free, he possessed privileges that most enslaved people could never dream of, yet he remained subject to the whims and violence of white supremacy. Dessalines had been born to a white father and an enslaved mother, a common situation that created a class of mixed-race people who often served as intermediaries between the white planter class and the enslaved population. His literacy and his position as an overseer gave him access to information and resources that would prove crucial to organizing resistance. The success of the Haitian Revolution, which had established the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere just 7 years earlier, provided both inspiration and practical knowledge for enslaved people throughout the Americas. News of Toussaint Louverture's victories against French colonial forces had spread through the slave quarters of Louisiana, carried by refugees, sailors, and enslaved people who had been transported between the Caribbean islands. By early January 1811, the sugar harvest had ended, and the plantations had entered the traditional period of reduced labor that followed the intense weeks of cutting and processing. This lull provided an opportunity for enslaved people to travel between plantations, attend religious gatherings, and engage in the kind of social interactions that made planning possible. The conspiracy that would erupt into the largest slave uprising in American history began to take shape during the first week of January 1811. Charles Dessalines had been meeting secretly with trusted allies for months, carefully building a network of potential rebels who shared his vision of violent liberation from the bonds of slavery. On January 6, 1811, a crucial meeting took place that would set the events of the following days in motion. As planter James Brown would later testify, the black Quamana, meaning born on Saturday, owned by Mr. Brown, and the mulatto Harry, owned by Messrs. Kenner and Henderson, were at the home of Manuel Andre on the night of Saturday through Sunday of the current month, in order to deliberate with the mulatto Charles Dessalines, chief of the brigands. This meeting represented the culmination of months of careful planning and recruitment. Dessalines and his co-conspirators had identified the optimal moment for their uprising, the post-harvest lull when plantation security was relaxed, when many white men would be away on business, and when the recent memory of brutal working conditions remained fresh in the minds of potential recruits. This wasn't just a spontaneous uprising, it was a carefully planned military operation that nearly succeeded in overthrowing slavery in Louisiana. Make sure you're subscribed to see how this rebellion unfolded. The conspirators drew upon African military traditions and knowledge gained from the Haitian Revolution to plan their campaign. Many of the enslaved people on the German coast had been born in West and Central Africa, where they had participated in complex military conflicts before their enslavement. This experience provided them with tactical knowledge that their masters had tried to suppress but could never completely eliminate. The plan was audacious in its scope and sophistication. Rather than attempting a simple escape to freedom, Deslandes and his allies envisioned capturing New Orleans itself, the largest city in the territory and the center of political and economic power. By seizing control of the city, they could potentially establish a free territory similar to Haiti, or at minimum create a bargaining position that could force concessions from white authorities. The rebels understood that success would require both military action and political legitimacy. They planned to march under banners and information, demonstrating that they were not merely a mob of angry slaves but an organized army fighting for liberty. This psychological warfare was designed to inspire enslaved people throughout the region while striking terror into the hearts of their oppressors. Communication networks that had been developed over years of plantation life now became crucial to the conspiracy's success. Enslaved people who worked as messengers, artisans, and domestic servants carried word of the planned uprising to plantations throughout the German coast. The rebels used coded language and traditional African communication methods to coordinate their efforts while avoiding detection by suspicious overseers. The timing of the uprising was carefully calculated to maximize their chances of success. January 8th was chosen because it fell during the traditional lull in plantation work, when many white men would be traveling on business and when enslaved people had greater freedom of movement. The rebels also understood that winter weather would make pursuit more difficult for mounted militiamen. Weapons procurement had been a central concern throughout the planning process. While enslaved people had access to agricultural tools that could serve as weapons, machetes, axes, and hoes, they needed firearms and ammunition to mount an effective military campaign. Deslandes' position as an overseer gave him access to the plantation's armory, while other conspirators identified additional sources of weapons on neighboring plantations. The psychological preparation for violent resistance required overcoming generations of conditioning that had taught enslaved people to submit to white authority. The conspirators drew upon African warrior traditions, Christian concepts of liberation, and Haitian revolutionary ideology to create a mental framework that justified and encouraged armed rebellion against their oppressors. As January 8th approached, approximately 25 core conspirators had committed themselves to the initial attack, with hundreds more enslaved people throughout the region prepared to join the uprising once it began. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of American slavery and send shockwaves throughout the nation. The attack that would launch America's largest slave rebellion began in the pre-dawn darkness of January 8, 1811, at Colonel Manuel Andre's woodland plantation. As the household slept peacefully in their beds, 25 armed enslaved men moved silently through the shadows toward the main house, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and determination that had been building for months. Charles Deslandes led his fellow conspirators through the familiar grounds of the plantation where he had served as overseer, his intimate knowledge of the layout proving crucial to the success of their surprise attack. The rebels carried a mixture of stolen firearms and improvised weapons, axes, machetes, and knives that would soon be stained with the blood of their oppressors. The attack erupted with savage violence as the rebels burst into the Andre mansion, seeking to eliminate the family that had profited from their suffering. Manuel Andre, the plantation owner, awoke to find armed enslaved men in his bedroom, their faces transformed by rage and determination that he had never seen before. An attempt was made to assassinate me by the stroke of an axe, Andre would later write, the terror of that moment still evident in his words. The axe blow that struck Andre was intended to be fatal, but the plantation owner's luck held as the weapon failed to deliver a killing stroke. Badly wounded but still alive, Andre watched in horror as the rebels turned their attention to his son Gilbert, who was not so fortunate. The young man was ferociously murdered by a horde of brigands, as his father would later describe the scene, his blood soaking into the floorboards of the family home. This was just the beginning of 3 days that would change American history forever. Hit that like button as we witness the moment enslaved people claimed their freedom through force. With the Andre family neutralized, the rebels moved swiftly to secure the weapons and supplies they would need for the campaign ahead. The plantation's armory yielded muskets, pistols, ammunition, and militia uniforms that would give the rebels the appearance of a legitimate military force. More importantly, these weapons transformed enslaved property into armed soldiers capable of challenging white supremacy on equal terms. The psychological transformation that occurred in those early morning hours was as significant as the physical violence. For the first time in their lives in America, these men held the power of life and death over their white oppressors. They were no longer slaves to be bought and sold. They were revolutionary soldiers fighting for the most basic human right, freedom. As word of the attack spread through the slave quarters, the rebels began to attract additional recruits. Enslaved people who had heard whispers of the planned uprising now saw that the moment of liberation had arrived. Some joined willingly, eager for their first taste of freedom in years or decades of bondage. Others were compelled to join, understanding that neutrality was no longer possible in a war between the enslaved and their masters. The rebels' decision to march openly rather than flee into the swamps revealed the sophisticated nature of their planning. This wasn't merely an escape attempt, it was a declaration of war against the institution of slavery itself. By marching in formation and carrying banners, they announced to the world that enslaved Africans would no longer accept bondage without violent resistance. Manuel Andre's survival proved crucial to the white response that would follow. Despite his wounds, the plantation owner managed to escape across the Mississippi River, where he immediately began organizing a militia response. His first-hand account of the attack would galvanize white resistance and provide crucial intelligence about the rebels' numbers and capabilities. The sound of gunfire and the glow of burning buildings announced to enslaved people throughout the German coast that the long-awaited moment of rebellion had arrived. Plantation bells that normally called slaves to work now rang out in alarm, warning white families of the approaching danger while simultaneously serving as a call to arms for potential recruits to the rebel cause. As dawn broke over the Louisiana landscape, the rebels controlled the Andre plantation and possessed the weapons they needed to continue their march toward New Orleans. Behind them lay the body of Gilbert Andre and the wounded form of his father, evidence that the age of unquestioned white supremacy in the territory of Orleans had come to a violent end. The rebels understood that there could be no turning back from the path they had chosen. They had crossed the ultimate line by killing their master's son and attacking a prominent white family. Their only choices now were victory or death, and they prepared to march toward New Orleans with the knowledge that they carried the hopes and dreams of every enslaved person in Louisiana. As the sun climbed higher on January 8, 1811, the rebel army began its historic march down the Mississippi River Road toward New Orleans, their numbers swelling with each plantation they encountered. What had begun as a force of 25 conspirators at the Andre plantation was rapidly growing into the largest slave army in American history, with estimates ranging from 200 to 500 participants by the time the uprising reached its peak. The rebels moved with military discipline that reflected the African warrior traditions and Haitian revolutionary experience that many brought to their cause. Charles Dessalines and his lieutenants organized their followers into units, each with its own commander who rode on horseback to maintain communication and control during the march. This wasn't a mindless mob but a structured military force with clear objectives and tactical awareness. The sight that greeted terrified white observers along the river road was unlike anything colonial or territorial America had ever witnessed. Hundreds of armed enslaved people marched openly in broad daylight, carrying banners that proclaimed their cause and singing songs of liberation that echoed across the Louisiana countryside. The psychological impact of this display was devastating to white morale and inspiring to enslaved onlookers. This army of freedom fighters grew larger with every mile they marched. Don't forget to share this video to help spread this incredible story that textbooks often ignore. At each plantation they encountered, the rebels faced crucial decisions about recruitment and violence. Their approach revealed a sophisticated understanding of the political and military challenges they faced. Enslaved people who were willing to join the cause were welcomed into their ranks, while those who hesitated were often compelled to participate through a combination of persuasion and force. The destruction of plantation property served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple revenge. By burning plantation houses, sugar mills, and crop fields, the rebels were eliminating the economic infrastructure that made slavery profitable while creating dramatic visual symbols of their power. The smoke rising from burning plantations could be seen for miles, announcing to everyone in the region that the impossible was happening. The rebels' treatment of white civilians they encountered revealed their understanding that this was total war against the system of racial oppression. Unlike later slave rebellions that would result in massive casualties among white families, the German coast uprising was remarkably restrained in its violence against non-combatants. Only 2 white men were killed during the entire 3-day rebellion, suggesting that the rebels were focused on military objectives rather than indiscriminate revenge. Female participation in the rebellion challenged traditional assumptions about both slavery and women's roles in violent resistance. Enslaved women joined the march in significant numbers, some carrying weapons and others providing crucial support services. Their presence transformed the rebellion from a military campaign into a community-wide assertion of freedom that included entire families. The rebels' decision to march directly down the main road rather than taking indirect routes through swamps and forests was a calculated risk that reflected their political sophistication. By maintaining visibility, they maximized their ability to recruit additional participants while demonstrating to the world that enslaved people could organize effective resistance. This boldness also served as psychological warfare against white authorities. Communication networks that had been developed over years of plantation life now proved crucial to the rebellion's rapid growth. Enslaved people who worked as artisans, messengers, and domestic servants spread word of the uprising to plantations throughout the region. The rebels used drums, horns, and other traditional African communication methods to coordinate their movements and call recruits to their cause. As the army approached the 40-year plantation on the evening of January 8th, their numbers had grown to several hundred participants. They had successfully controlled approximately 20 miles of the most productive agricultural region in the territory of Orleans, disrupting the economic foundation of Louisiana slavery while inspiring enslaved people throughout the Mississippi Valley. The rebels established their camp at the 40-year plantation with military precision, posting guards and organizing their forces for the final push toward New Orleans. They understood that the next day would bring the ultimate test of their cause, a confrontation with organized military forces that would determine whether their bid for freedom would succeed or end in bloody defeat. As night fell on January 8, 1811, the largest slave army in American history prepared for the battles that lay ahead. They had achieved something unprecedented in the annals of American slavery: the creation of a liberated zone controlled by armed enslaved people who had successfully challenged white supremacy through organized violence. The news of armed enslaved people marching toward New Orleans spread like wildfire through the white communities of Louisiana on January 9, 1811, creating panic and chaos that paralyzed the territorial government. By noon, Governor William Claiborne had received multiple reports of the uprising, each more alarming than the last, as fleeing plantation families brought tales of burning buildings and armed rebels who seemed to control the countryside. The sight of terrified white refugees flooding into New Orleans created a 9-mile traffic jam on the road leading into the city, as families abandoned their plantations with whatever possessions they could carry. Governor Claiborne, understanding the mortal threat posed by hundreds of armed enslaved people, immediately ordered troops to seal the city and refuse entry to any black person, whether enslaved or free. The territorial government faced a military crisis of unprecedented proportions. Most regular troops were deployed elsewhere fighting in ongoing conflicts, leaving Claiborne with limited resources to counter the rebellion. He managed to assemble only 2 companies of volunteer militias and 30 regular troops, supplemented by naval forces under the command of Commodore John Shaw. The colonial government was nearly overwhelmed by this massive uprising. Make sure you're subscribed to see how they managed to crush this rebellion through overwhelming brutality. General Wade Hampton I, one of the most experienced military commanders in the territory, took personal command of the forces assembled to suppress the rebellion. Hampton understood that the stakes went far beyond Louisiana. A successful slave uprising could inspire similar rebellions throughout the American South, potentially destroying the economic foundation of the entire region. The military response revealed the sophisticated nature of the rebel strategy. When government forces reached what they believed was the rebel encampment at the 40-year plantation, they found it abandoned. Deslands and his army had employed classic military deception, using advance and retreat tactics borrowed from West African warfare to confuse and frustrate their pursuers. This tactical maneuvering demonstrated that the rebels possessed military knowledge that their white opponents had underestimated. Many of the enslaved participants had served as soldiers in African conflicts before their enslavement, and they drew upon this experience to outmaneuver professionally trained American forces. The psychological impact of being outfoxed by enslaved people sent shockwaves through the white military establishment. Meanwhile, Manuel Andre, despite his wounds from the initial attack, had crossed the Mississippi River and begun organizing local militia forces. Working with Charles Perret and other prominent planters, Andre assembled approximately 80 well-armed men who knew the terrain intimately and had personal stakes in crushing the rebellion. The convergence of professional military forces from New Orleans and local militia units created a pincer movement designed to trap the rebels between 2 armies. This strategy reflected the desperation of white authorities who understood that failure to suppress the uprising quickly could lead to its spread throughout the slave-holding regions of the South. On January 10th, the 2 forces finally converged on the rebels near Bernard Bernoudy's plantation, approximately 15 miles upriver from their starting point. The rebels, numbering between 200 and 500 according to various accounts, found themselves facing a heavily armed force of professional soldiers and local militiamen who were fighting to preserve their entire way of life. The battle that erupted was swift and devastating. Charles Perret, commanding the local militia, ordered his men to attack the rebels who had taken position on high ground near the Bernouty plantation. The rebels, despite their courage and determination, faced overwhelming disadvantages in terms of weapons, ammunition, and tactical position. The firepower disparity became immediately apparent as the militia's superior weapons cut down rebel ranks with devastating efficiency. Within 30 minutes of the initial assault, between 40 and 45 rebels lay dead on the battlefield, while the white forces suffered no casualties. The surviving rebels, recognizing the hopelessness of their position, fled into the surrounding swamps and forests. The aftermath of the battle revealed the calculated nature of white vengeance. Rather than simply accepting surrender, the militia systematically hunted down fleeing rebels, killing many without trial or quarter. This wasn't merely military necessity, it was deliberate terrorism designed to crush any remaining thoughts of resistance among the enslaved population. The pursuit continued throughout January 10th as militia forces, assisted by Native American trackers and hunting dogs, combed the swamps and forests for surviving rebels. Each captured rebel represented both a military victory and an opportunity for psychological warfare against the broader enslaved community. The capture of Charles Deslandes on January 11th marked the beginning of the most brutal phase of the white response to the German coast uprising. Tracked down by hunting dogs in the marshes where he had sought refuge, the rebellion's leader was dragged before his captors to face a fate designed to terrorize every enslaved person in Louisiana. What followed was not justice but calculated torture intended to break the spirit of resistance throughout the enslaved community. Naval officer Samuel Hamilton documented Deslandes' execution with chilling precision. Charles Deslandes had his hands chopped off, then shot in one thigh and then the other, until they were both broken, then shot in the body, and before he had expired was put into a bundle of straw and roasted. His screams of agony echoed across the marshes, carrying a message of terror to any other rebels who might still be hiding. The systematic brutality didn't end with Deslandes' death. Pierre Griffey and Hans Wimpren, identified as the killers of white planters during the uprising, were captured, murdered, and decapitated, their severed heads delivered to the André estate as grotesque trophies of white vengeance. This wasn't simply punishment, it was psychological warfare designed to crush the spirit of every enslaved person who witnessed or heard about these atrocities. The aftermath of this rebellion would reshape slavery laws throughout America. Hit that notification bell to ensure you never miss these crucial historical stories that shaped our nation. The white authorities' response revealed their understanding that the rebellion represented an existential threat to the entire system of racial oppression. Rather than simply executing the captured rebels, they created an elaborate theater of terror designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance while reinforcing white supremacy through spectacular violence. 3 separate tribunals were established to try the captured rebels. One at Decapitated Plantation in St. Charles Parish, another in St. John the Baptist Parish, and a third in New Orleans. These weren't courts seeking justice but instruments of vengeance designed to legitimize predetermined executions while creating maximum psychological impact. The Decapitated trials, overseen by Judge Pierre Baucher St. Martin, resulted in the execution of 18 of 21 captured rebels by firing squad. The proceedings were a mockery of justice, with all-white juries composed of plantation owners who had personal stakes in demonstrating the consequences of slave rebellion. Some enslaved witnesses testified against their fellow rebels, likely under threat of death, while others maintained their silence even facing execution. The New Orleans trials followed a similar pattern of predetermined guilt and summary execution. 11 more rebels were convicted and executed, with 3 publicly hanged in the Place d'Armes, now Jackson Square, to maximize the terrorizing impact on the city's large enslaved and free black population. The public nature of these executions was specifically designed to send a message throughout the region. The most horrifying aspect of the white response was the systematic display of severed heads along the roads of Louisiana. The heads of executed rebels were mounted on pikes and positioned at strategic locations from New Orleans to the André plantation, creating a 60-mile corridor of death designed to terrorize the enslaved population. Naval officer Samuel Hamilton described this grotesque display with chilling matter-of-factness. They were brung up here for the sake of their heads, which decorate our levee, all the way up the coast. I am told they look like crows sitting on long poles. By the end of January, nearly 100 heads were displayed along the levee, nearly quadrupling the number from a previous 1795 uprising. The psychological warfare extended beyond visual displays to include deliberate cruelty designed to break the spirits of survivors. A 13-year-old boy was spared execution but forced to witness another man's death before receiving 30 lashes. These calculated acts of mercy mixed with brutality were designed to demonstrate that white power could be both terrible and magnanimous. The few rebels who escaped execution faced fates that many considered worse than death: sailed to sugar plantations in the West Indies, where working conditions were so brutal that life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. This exile served both to remove dangerous individuals from Louisiana and to send a message about the consequences of rebellion. The trials and executions continued for weeks after the rebellion's suppression, as white authorities systematically hunted down anyone who had participated in or supported the uprising. The goal wasn't simply punishment, but the complete eradication of any remaining spirit of resistance among the enslaved population. The legal proceedings revealed the depths of white fear about slave rebellion. The speed and thoroughness of the executions demonstrated that plantation owners understood they were fighting for their lives and their entire economic system. Every executed rebel sent a message that challenging white supremacy would result in the most horrific death imaginable. The German Coast Uprising's immediate aftermath transformed slavery throughout Louisiana and sent shockwaves across the American South that would influence racial policies for decades to come. The scale and organization of the rebellion forced white authorities to confront the reality that their enslaved population possessed both the capability and the determination to challenge white supremacy through coordinated violence. In response to the uprising, Louisiana authorities implemented some of the most restrictive slave codes in American history. New laws prohibited enslaved people from gathering in groups, restricted their movement between plantations, and criminalized any activities that might facilitate future rebellions. The Sunday afternoon gatherings that had served as communication networks were permanently banned, while surveillance of the enslaved population was dramatically increased. Governor Claiborne's request to Washington for a permanent military presence revealed the depth of fear that the rebellion had instilled in white Louisiana. The federal government's response, officially admitting Louisiana as a slave state just months after the uprising, demonstrated that national leaders understood the importance of maintaining strict control over the enslaved population. This rebellion's impact extended far beyond Louisiana, influencing slavery laws throughout America. Share this video to help preserve this crucial but often forgotten history. The suppression of detailed coverage about the uprising by national media revealed a deliberate strategy to prevent the rebellion from inspiring similar uprisings elsewhere. Unlike Gabriel's rebellion in Virginia or later uprisings that received extensive coverage, the German Coast Rebellion was largely ignored by newspapers outside Louisiana, reflecting white fears that publicizing successful slave organization might encourage imitation. Despite efforts to erase the rebellion from historical memory, its impact on the enslaved community was profound and lasting. The uprising proved that large-scale organized resistance was possible, even if ultimately unsuccessful. Stories of Charles Dessalines and his followers were preserved in African American oral traditions, inspiring future generations of freedom fighters. The rebellion's influence extended to later slave uprisings throughout the American South. Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in Charleston, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, and other acts of resistance drew inspiration from the German coast precedent, understanding that enslaved people could organize effectively and challenge white supremacy through armed resistance. The economic impact of the uprising forced fundamental changes in Louisiana's plantation system. The destruction of 5 plantation houses, multiple sugar mills, and extensive crop fields demonstrated the vulnerability of the slave-based economy to organized resistance. Planters invested heavily in security measures, while reconsidering the risks of maintaining large concentrations of enslaved workers. Modern historical scholarship has increasingly recognized the German Coast Uprising as one of the most significant events in American history. Rather than viewing it as a footnote to the story of slavery, historians now understand that the rebellion revealed fundamental tensions that would ultimately contribute to the Civil War and the eventual abolition of slavery. The archaeological investigation of rebellion sites has provided new insights into the participants and their motivations. These discoveries continue to enrich our understanding of how enslaved people organized resistance, while maintaining hope in the face of overwhelming oppression. Contemporary commemorations of the uprising reflect growing recognition of its historical significance. Since 1995, the African American History Alliance of Louisiana has led annual commemorations of the rebellion, bringing together descendants of participants and community members to honor the courage of those who fought for freedom. In 2019, artist Dred Scott organized a large-scale reenactment of the German Coast Uprising, recruiting hundreds of participants to retrace the rebels' march from Laplace to New Orleans. This artistic intervention brought renewed attention to the rebellion, while connecting its legacy to contemporary struggles for racial justice. The rebellion site at Woodland Plantation has become a place of pilgrimage and remembrance, now under Black ownership for the first time since the uprising. This transformation represents a form of historical justice, as the descendants of enslaved people have reclaimed the land where their ancestors fought and died for freedom. Educational initiatives have increasingly incorporated the German Coast Uprising into curricula about American history, recognizing that understanding slave resistance is crucial to comprehending the full complexity of the American experience. The rebellion story challenges narratives that portray enslaved people as passive victims while highlighting their agency and determination. The rebellion's legacy resonates powerfully with modern civil rights movements. The Black Lives Matter movement has drawn explicit connections between historical slave resistance and contemporary struggles against police brutality and systemic racism, understanding that the fight for racial justice represents a continuation of struggles that began with the first enslaved Africans brought to America. The courage of Charles Deslandes and his fellow freedom fighters reminds us that the struggle for human dignity never ends. Subscribe to this channel and share this video to ensure their sacrifice is never forgotten. Their blood watered the seeds of freedom that would eventually grow into the broader movement for human rights in America. Though they died in bondage, their legacy lives on in every person who refuses to accept injustice and oppression. The rebels' march toward New Orleans echoes through the centuries, challenging each generation to expand the boundaries of freedom and human dignity.